Darién Gap, the $10 trillion wall no government can break. The $10 trillion wall. 66 miles of jungle just wiped a line from the world's balance sheet. A convoy stalls at a river that looks knee-deep until it is. A man with a radio raises a wrist full of colored bands. No band, no crossing. Behind them, a woman clutches a toddler. Ahead, a price list in whispers. Meanwhile, in a Washington file cabinet, a USDA memo calls this jungle a prophylactic against AFTOSA. They meant microbes, not migrants. Nixon once promised to drive this road by the Bicentennial. Today, logistics managers reroute ships and pray. 3 shocks by 5 minutes. The Microbe Wall, the Cartel toll road, the hidden ban on bridges. The jungle as a toll road. To understand why nobody breaks this wall, look at how it earns. The jungle isn't empty. It's a corridor with prices. Lives are the stakes, but so is sovereign control. Every rain-swollen stream becomes a checkpoint, every muddy ridge a toll gate. In a month of heavy flow, tens of millions move, mostly in cash, in fear, in silence. Here's what actually happens. On the Colombian side, staging towns hum like frontier depots. Necoclí's beaches fill with tents, Turbo's docks thrum with outboards. Guides affiliated with the Gulf clan approach in plain clothes. They sell packages, not tickets. A plastic wristband identifies your route and your tier. Green bands mean the basic trail, more days, more risk. Yellow buys a boat shortcut up an inlet, shaving a day. Red promises express, extra porters, better guides, and a backup plan if a river rises. At dawn, groups funnel toward the tree line in columns. The first hour is optimism. By midday, ankles sink to the calf in black mud. The trail isn't a line, it's a churned funnel where dozens of feet widen the cut. Rivers aren't static. Yesterday's ford is today's chest-deep current. The guide points upstream, pay for a rope crossing or wait. Someone pays, the rope appears. The cartel's pricing reflects weather and volume. After storms, the fee climbs. When the seas are calm, the boat leg gets cheaper, but the upland route, safer from patrols, costs more. There's a menu for fear, satellite trackers pinging loved ones every 6 hours, safe houses with a tarp roof and a bucket, a porter to carry a child, 1 seat in a dugout if a landslide buries the switchbacks. Cash only unless you accept debt. Debt means you owe someone in Mexico City. Micro stories travel faster than the jungle. A family's phone becomes a wallet at gunpoint. The toddler watches his cartoons disappear with the sim. A fixer tries to beat the river after a week of storms, misjudges the brown boil, and doesn't surface. A woman in soaked jeans negotiates for a dry shirt with her last earrings. Meanwhile, in a camp, a man counts wristbands at dusk and checks a ledger. The quota met, the route's still theirs. The monopoly is operational, not legal. The Gulf clan doesn't own the trees. They own the predictability, wristband colors, departure windows, known camps. If you stray, you pay twice, first in time, then in risk. Predictability is a product, and the market is efficient. That efficiency turns people into moving ATMs. Every checkpoint extracts something: cash, shoes, food, or information. The takers vary: armed men with armbands, kids with machetes, a boatman's cousin. But the system feels like one hand. Where are the states? Present enough to be seen, absent enough to be useful. On the Panamanian side, uniformed patrols guide exhausted groups toward humanitarian camps, water, calories, a headcount, fingerprints. On the Colombian side, crackdowns come in bursts. Boats are seized, then quietly returned. A prosecutor posts photos, but the routes don't change long. Each selective enforcement shaves competitors and sustains the price. Meanwhile, politicians count costs. In Panama City, the canal comes first. The gap is a shock absorber, soaks movement, delays problems. In Bogotá, the jungle is a buffer between insurgent histories and today's negotiations. Closing the routes outright would push flows into new, less visible corridors, bad for data, bad for control. So the calculus lands on managed permeability, enough friction to slow, not enough to stop. Pricing tells you the model. There are insurance, add-ons, an extra guide for the steep ridge locals call the Hill of Death, a satellite ping when the group clears the worst ravine, a promised place on a truck north of the camps. Express buyers get preferential river crossings, a tarp over the fire, and someone to wake them before thieves. Value is safety measured in hours saved and panic avoided. Corruption fuses the corridor. A fee on a dock buys a blind eye. A tip at a police post buys an escort that's for your protection. A cut goes to a local leader who'd rather keep the route calm than invite gunfire. It's governance, delivered by violence and predictability. The wristband is a tax stamp as much as a ticket. And the weather writes the margin. 20 feet of rain a year turns clay to grease and rivers into moving walls. After a week of deluge, the risk of flash floods spikes, prices rise. In the dry, snakes and heat take their share. Whatever the season, risk transfers downward. The cartel doesn't lose sleep if a bridge washes out. They never promised a bridge. They promised a crossing. What nobody knew the first time they heard impassable is that impassable sells. By keeping the road hypothetical, the product stays scarce. A paved route would bring competition, regulation, and the kind of transparency that kills margins. The mud is a moat. The jungle prints cash. While that's happening in the trees, something else is taxing everyone too small to see. Not a gun, not a wristband, a microbe. The people at those river crossings aren't the only traffic that matters. Cattle, pigs, viruses, they move differently. And that's why when Washington once tried to bulldoze a path, the answer came from a lab, not a guard post. The Microbe Wall, AFTOSA. To understand why the rope appears but the bridge never does, we need to shrink the story to the size of a virus. Foot and mouth disease, AFTOSA isn't lethal to most animals, but it terrorizes balance sheets. Blisters on hooves, fevers, milk lost, weight lost, entire herds culled to stop the spread. In the United States, one outbreak would snap export markets shut overnight and send beef and dairy prices spiking. That's the stake. Not romance, not mud. Food, jobs, and billions. Washington learned this lesson the hard way looking south. In the mid-20th century, outbreaks rolled across parts of South America. The US built a perimeter of veterinarians, labs, and quarantines through USDA's APHIS and its AFTOSA programs, backing eradication campaigns country by country. It wasn't charity. It was a cordon sanitaire to keep a virus from walking north on cloven hooves. The Darien, thick and roadless, served perfectly, a biological moat. Here's how the logic worked. Roads move more than people. They move vectors. Trucks that carry cattle, pigs, hides, and feed also carry contaminated mud on tires, virus on boots, saliva on gate latches. A formal highway stitches ecosystems together. It accelerates every contact. In modeling exercises, a paved corridor through Darien didn't just shorten time. It multiplied risk by opening new chains of transmission, formal and informal, that no checkpoint could fully police. Policy followed the lab coats. In the 1970s, as momentum built to punch through the gap, USDA flagged AFTOSA as an unacceptable threat. APHIS guidance made biosecurity a priority, and the term prophylactic barrier slipped into memos. That phrase mattered later when the courtroom lights flicked on. Environmentalists had sued, citing wilderness and endangered species, but judges also heard about disease risk. The jungle, in this telling, wasn't just biodiversity. It was a sanitary line. What nobody outside the agencies grasped at the time was how rare it was to ask an American court to weigh the fallout of a road in Panama against a virus in Texas. Yet that's what happened. Case files and administrative records piled up with affidavits from veterinarians and epidemiologists. AFTOSA's persistence in parts of South America, the speed of viral spread once it enters a naive herd, the trade embargo triggers, each point stacked like sandbags against the bulldozers. Action on the ground slowed. Engineering consortia had surveyed alignments and logistics, equipment had staged. Then permits froze, funding paused, and the calendar slipped. Inside agencies, a new phrase took hold: no road as biosecurity. It wasn't written on billboards, but it framed decisions. You could spend on eradication programs south of the line, on vaccinations and surveillance, and you could keep the gap wild enough to function like a lid on a petri dish. The impact was immediate in policy and long in memory. The microbe wall became precedent. Sanitary and phytosanitary arguments, SBS, in trade speak, would later show up in WTO disputes and border debates worldwide. You could argue for keeping corridors closed not just to protect forests, but to protect supply chains from biological shocks. In a century that would see mad cow disease and avian influenza hit export markets, that argument only grew teeth. Meanwhile, the cattle map shifted. Countries that beat AFTOSA gained access, premiums, and leverage. Those that didn't found their beef stuck in regional circuits. A paved road through one of the greatest pathogen filters in the hemisphere threatened to scramble that equilibrium. For US producers, the calculus was brutal. One highway risked billions in market confidence. Insurance companies understood it, so did trade negotiators. There's a detail from an internal briefing that sticks. A veterinarian sketches a simple chain, hoof lesion to viral shedding to contaminated truck to ranch gate 500 miles away. He taps the truck. "This is the road," he says. Then he circles the gap on a map. This is the absence of a road. It wasn't poetry, it was policy. The absence itself did work. Now remember Nixon's promise to cut a ribbon by 1976. The motorcade, the cameras, the idea of a continent unified by asphalt. In Washington, the push ran into the invisible line already drawn by labs and livestock economics. When environmental law entered the scene, it gave judges a lever to pull on both ecology and epidemiology. Nixon's fall removed the political tailwind. The combined drag of lawsuits, biosecurity warnings, and swelling cost estimates did the rest. What survived in the files is a quiet doctrine. If a road increases the odds of catastrophic disease entry, and if the benefit isn't clearly outweighing that risk, don't build the road. Not pause, not delay, don't build. That's how microbes, not militants, locked a frontier. The ripple effects weren't just negative. Panama and Colombia could point to global commitments, biodiversity, indigenous rights, disease control, and align them with domestic caution. In North America, industry groups slept easier. In South America, eradication campaigns pressed on with uneven success. The gap held. Here's where it gets interesting. Decades later, as migration surged and cartels learned to tax the mud, the microbe wall never moved. It still sits under every policy meeting, an unspoken veto in the room. You can patrol a river, you can stage a camp, but you can't negotiate with AFTOSA. Washington had tried to bulldoze through the jungle. The lab said no, and that no would swallow a president's highway. Nixon's Bicentennial highway that vanished. 3 years before Watergate, the drawings were already curling at the edges. Survey flags dotted ridgelines that only scouts and jaguars knew. In Washington, a man practiced a ribbon-cutting smile. The Pan American Highway, born as a 1920s dream of continental unity, had one ragged hole left. Nixon wanted his name on the stitch. Now remember the mood. Late 1960s into early 1970s, grand projects still meant something. Apollo, the interstate system, the canal always looming in the background. Closing the Darien felt like destiny and theater. The speechwriters sketched a motorcade crawling from pavement into mud and back to pavement, a metaphor you could photograph. He told allies he planned to drive it by 1976. The Bicentennial, cameras on the hood, a president doing what conquistadors couldn't. The phrase Nixon Highway floated through hallways, half joke, half intent. Diplomats turned that ambition into pressure. US embassies leaned on Panama and Colombia. Align your timelines, clear the right-of-way, we'll cover 2/3 of the cost if you deliver your third. Technical teams flew south. Engineering consortia split the problem into bites. Bridges here, causeways there, drainage everywhere. Helicopters traced alignments over swamps and jungled spurs. Cost estimates swelled like the rivers below them. Still, the momentum felt irreversible. Meanwhile, the lab memos we've already met were circulating. USDA's warnings about foot-and-mouth disease landed on the same desks that stamped clearances. But inside the administration, the political urgency to finish the road often outran the scientific caution. You could hear it in meeting notes. Mitigate later, keep the schedule. A president doesn't cut ribbons on quarantines. On the ground, early works began where they could. Contractors carved access tracks toward the Atrato lowlands and mapped foundation points that would need piles deeper than anyone liked to pay for. Helicopter sling loads floated rebar into clearings. Indigenous leaders watched strangers mark trees that had names in their languages and numbers in someone else's ledger. Environmentalists in the US took note. Here's where the legal weather changed. In 1970, the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, gave federal courts a new vocabulary and a new lever. By 1975, the Sierra Club sued the U.S. Department of Transportation over its role funding the gap closure. It wasn't just trees, they argued. It was a chain reaction. Deforestation halos along the road, wildlife loss, rivers choked with sediment, and yes, the sanitary line against AFTOSA torn open. Applying an American environmental law to a project outside U.S. territory felt novel. But federal money meant federal procedure, and the judge wanted an environmental impact statement that met the new bar. While the lawyers argued precedent, the jungle did its quiet work. The water table sat where it pleased. Test pits filled as fast as they were dug. Engineers ran scour calculations for bridges meant to stand against sediment loads that shifted like opinions in Washington. Every solution carried a maintenance tail nobody wanted to explain to Congress. And every month, bids came back higher. Then Watergate detonated. Nixon resigned in 1974. The Bicentennial motor parade vanished with the helicopter from the South Lawn. Without a champion, the highway lost its headline and its deadline. Inside agencies, caution replaced bravado. The court challenges didn't end, they hardened. The AFTOSA logic gave the bench a second anchor, biosecurity layered over biodiversity. The phrase prophylactic barrier appeared not in speeches, but in footnotes that mattered more. Diplomatically, the tempo shifted. Panama and Colombia, both juggling internal pressures and external expectations, read the room. Indigenous claims gained voice, protected areas gained teeth. Negotiators could now say no with science and law behind them. The US quietly deprioritized the line item. Funding slid into studies. Studies slid into shelves. There's a micro story from the files. A contractor representative in a hotel bar in Panama City, 1976, calling his office to say the insurers had added exclusions for sabotage and disease-related shutdowns. "We can build it," he says, "but we can't insure it." 2 weeks later, the consortium withdraws a tranche of equipment from staging. The survey flags in the forest rot where they stand and disappear under regrowth. The lesson hardened into doctrine without anyone announcing it. NEPA's reach could slow or stop foreign infrastructure where US funds flowed. Sierra Club v. became a cautionary tale in federal hallways. AFTOSA's stance on AFTOSA carved a veto that didn't need headlines. Engineering challenges never technically defeated the project, but they made every defense of it more expensive and every objection to it more credible. When the Bicentennial came, the ribbon Nixon wanted stayed uncut. The cameras turned elsewhere. The gap remained a gap. After that, the road became a ghost. Maps showed it as proposed, memos spoke of future consideration, and budgets found easier victories. The dream died, and with it, the moment when asphalt might have crossed the microbes and the mud. What survived is more revealing than the pavement that didn't. Agencies learned how to say no by saying yes to other values: disease control, indigenous consent, protected biomes. Politicians learned that some walls pay for themselves by never being built. And a jungle once framed as an engineering problem became a policy instrument with a passport stamp. The dream faded, the costs didn't. The $10 now we have to count them. Geography bill. The dream faded, the costs didn't. If you want to see the bill, follow the trucks that never roll. Every mile that isn't paved through the gap gets paid somewhere else. On a ship that detours, at a port that doubles capacity, in a warehouse that holds inventory like a hostage, because time got more expensive. Here's the stake in simple terms: distance becomes a tax. Geography isn't neutral, it's financialized. The Darién Gap turns two continents that nearly touch into supply chains that behave like distant strangers. For 50 years, companies priced that distance into freight quotes, insurance premiums, and delivery promises they could only keep by overspending. Add those frictions year after year across 18 countries, and the number grows until it stops feeling real. Now remember how trade actually flows. Gravity models say big economies pull trade like planets pull tides. When you cut travel time, flows spike. When you add friction, they thin. The gap adds friction you can't negotiate away. A Chilean fruit shipper that could have run refrigerated trucks north through a biosecure corridor routes to Pacific ports instead, then reloads to rail in Mexico or the US, a Peruvian copper concentrate that might have gone by container to a processing hub inland, goes bulk to a Pacific terminal already congested, paying for queues and demurrage. a Brazilian manufacturer who might have served Central America out of one distribution center in Colombia splits inventory between Caribbean and Pacific nodes, duplicating buildings, staff, and risk. The action is subtle and constant. A logistics manager in Bogotá opens a spreadsheet and watches days in transit become cash tied up. A procurement head in Mexico City adds 2 weeks of safety stock to cover variability that a highway would have shaved. A shipper in Quito pays an insurance premium on reefers because a sea leg crosses where the windows you can't compress. Each cost looks small. Together, they're a drag on growth. Meanwhile, substitution hides the loss. Air freight fills the gap when urgency trumps price, so a pallet of perishables flies at 10 times the cost of a truck. Ports expand because ships must, so governments pour billions into dredging and cranes that act like a workaround rather than a plan. Airports extend cold chains north and south of the gap, duplicating infrastructure to bridge what a road would have linked. Every workaround has a maintenance tail, OPEX compounds. Counterfactuals tell the other side. Model a controlled corridor with biosecurity, sealed freight, disinfection, checkpoints that work. Then watch what changes. Routings flip, trucking companies invest in north-south fleets, border towns become logistics hubs rather than waiting rooms. You'd expect regional ag belts to connect to new markets. Colombian cattle to processed exports north once sanitary status allows. Peruvian produce in trucks reaching Central American supermarkets within days, not weeks. You'd expect minerals to move to smelters where energy is cheapest, not where ships happen to call. Opportunity cost doesn't send an invoice. It accumulates in choices never made. A Colombian rail spur that would have penciled out with highway feeders never got built. A Panamanian province adjacent to the gap filled with informal commerce, stalls, motels, fixers, rather than formal investment because every business model assumed churn, not stability. Investors saw the map and moved capital to coastlines where ships call and law concentrates. Inland stayed future tense. So why say 10 trillion? Not as a single check, but as 50 years of compounded deltas. GDP that grew slower than it would have if time cost of distance fell. Risk premiums that kept money cautious. Duplicated port and air capacity that masked inefficiency. Energy burned moving goods in circles, carbon priced nowhere. Add missed ag corridors, underused mineral routes, and a services economy that never scaled to continental integration because the backbone wasn't there. That's the magnitude. The human side lands softer in spreadsheets but harder in life. Cities that could have been factory towns became transit points. Young people left provinces adjacent to the gap because value moved around them by sea and sky. Jobs that clustering would have created, maintenance yards, warehouses, cold chain technicians, materialized elsewhere. And when a disruption hits, pandemic, drought, canal delays, the lack of redundancy shows. There's no inland relief valve. Ships stack, shelves thin, prices wobble. Meanwhile, policy defaults became habits. Trade agreements promised integration while the map enforced separation. Governments celebrated port expansions as national achievements because there was nothing else to cut ribbons on. The very success of maritime workarounds entrenched the idea that a land bridge was optional. It was expensive to ignore. There's a micro story from a distributor in San Jose. He runs numbers on stocking Chilean cherries for holiday season. With a highway, he could truck in refrigerated loads from Santiago through a sterilized corridor and stage them just in time. Without it, he books containers weeks earlier, pays for cold storage, eats waste when weather shifts, and raises retail prices to survive. When his customers ask why it costs more this year, he shrugs and says, "The route." He means the absence of one. Here's the quiet irony. The same jungle that holds microbes at bay also holds integration at bay. The biosecurity logic saved billions in avoided disease shocks. The geography logic charged billions in slow bleed. The balance sheet isn't simple, but ignoring the bill doesn't make it smaller. And yet money isn't the only thing this jungle protects. There's value here that can't be moved by truck, and risks a road could amplify. We have to weigh those too before anyone reaches for asphalt. The biodiversity and biosecurity trade. And yet money isn't the only thing this jungle protects. Between the Atratos swamps and the Serrania del Darienes ridges sits one of Earth's great ecological hinges, a living bridge where two continents trade genes. Jaguars from the south find cousins from the north. Harpy eagles ride thermals over river courses that stitch mangroves to cloud forest. Orchids bloom that exist nowhere else. This is a corridor, not just a canopy. Here's why that matters beyond postcards. Species don't read borders. They move to find mates, food, and cooler slopes as heat rises. The Darien is a pass-through and a refuge at once. When you cut forest with a road, you don't just drop pavement, you draw an edge. Along that edge, the wind dries, the sun bites deeper, and the forest retreats a little more each year. Hunters get easier access. Chainsaws arrive with gasoline. In the Amazon, they call it a deforestation halo. The halo grows where tires roll. Now remember the microbe wall. Biosecurity isn't only about cattle viruses. Build a road and you build invasion pathways. Rats ride grain trucks. Mosquitoes bloom entire ruts and borrow our speed. Feral pigs trail human food waste and rip through native understory, spreading parasites that domestic herds can't shake. The same logistics that move tomatoes can move ticks. Every new contact is a coin flip, and the house wins often when nature is naive to the intruder. What actually happens on road fronts is brutally predictable. A pristine segment opens. Within months, cut lines branch like capillaries. Hunting pressure spikes because access is cheap. Bushmeat markets fatten in towns a day's travel away. Ecologists have watched this pattern in the Amazon on BR-163 and along Andean foothill roads that looked low impact on paper. The first year feels harmless. By year 5, you can see the forest from space as a mosaic of wounds. Meanwhile, zoonotic risk rises with the halo. Edge forests host species that tolerate humans, rodents, bats, generalist birds. They're good virus vessels. People rush in loggers, settlers, transport workers, living in camps that lack sanitation. That's a petri dish with diesel. You don't need to invent disasters to see the path. Ebola taught Central Africa. SARS and avian influenza taught Asia. In the Americas, yellow fever rode edges and roads a century ago. The lesson hasn't aged. The Darien's carbon matters too. Peat-rich swamps and mature stands store decades of breath. Open a road and fire risk climbs where it was rare. A lit field edge can jump a ditch on a hot wind. Once a forest patch burns, flammable grasses colonize. The next burn comes easier. Carbon that sat quiet becomes someone's quarterly metric. So you've got value that can't be cashed out quickly. Biodiversity, carbon sinks, disease buffers, set against the gains a corridor could bring. The policy move over decades has been to let nature take the credit for stopping the bulldozers, while biosecurity does quiet work in the background. Protected areas multiply. Darién National Park in Panama, Los Cayos in Colombia, indigenous comarcas with legal standing. International conventions, CITES, CBD wrap these maps with rules. They don't eliminate pressure. They slow it, give prosecutors and park guards something to point to when money talks loud. It isn't purity. Enforcement is uneven. Rangers go months without fuel. A mining crew slips upriver and sinks test pits at night. But the legal net plus the mud makes every kilometer of illegal road more expensive than the last. That cost curve is policy. Foot-and-mouth disease slips back into the frame here. Even if a road came with patrols and disinfectant mats and sealed freight rules, you can't patrol every boot, every spilled drop of saliva on a loading gate, every backyard pig that noses a discarded sandwich. Road networks amplify vectors. That's why when agencies weigh mitigation, they keep coming back to the same line: keep the barrier. In trade language, it's an SBS preference that doubles as conservation. Global precedent reinforces the caution. Along the Amazon arc, road paving predicted deforestation more than law predicted compliance. Along Africa's Congo basin, logging spurs triggered wildlife decline far beyond their ends. You can design best practices, wildlife overpasses, fencing, quarantines, but OPEX eats budgets and enforcement decays. A rainforest road is a subscription, not a purchase. Miss a payment and the forest calls debt collectors you don't want. There's a human counterweight worth saying out loud. Indigenous communities have stewarded these lands for generations with systems that keep game moving and forests standing. When roads push in, their land rights become the last meaningful lock. Where those rights are real, titled, respected, resourced, the corridor does its ecological job and communities do theirs. Where they're performative, the bulldozers find seams. So the trade isn't abstract. It's a policy ledger with line items that don't share units. A highway promises speed and scale with risks that linger for decades if you misjudge them. A jungle promises buffers and biodiversity with costs that compound if you overvalue them. The reason the wall holds is that, for now, the biosecurity and biodiversity columns keep outvoting asphalt. While nature gets the credit, power brokers read the same balance sheet and see a different benefit. The moat protects more than birds and cattle. It protects strategies. And the people who can't cross safely keep paying for a wall no one has to vote for. The quiet buffer state strategy. While nature gets the credit, policy writes the playbook. From Panama City's glass towers, the doctrine sounds almost boring. Canal first, everything else second. The Darien functions like a shock absorber, softens impacts before they rattle the country's core asset. You hear it between lines in cabinet briefings. Keep crises far from Colon's container yards. Keep headlines off the locks. Keep budget lines for dredging and pilots untouched by jungle drama. Here's how that logic works on the ground. When flows surge, Panama pushes capacity where it controls optics. Reception camps, medical triage buses out. The state's presence is strongest after the mud, not in it. That isn't neglect, it's triage geometry. Pushing enforcement deep into the gap invites firefights, bad footage, and sunk costs with little payoff. Keeping response north of the tree line turns chaos into queues. The jungle does the delaying, the state does the sorting. The canal frames every decision. A blockade there is existential. A surge in Darien is elastic. If you're a finance minister deciding where to spend your next dollar, the spreadsheet nudges you to Gatun before Jacquet. Meanwhile, buffer logic extends to diplomacy. Panama cultivates funding for interdiction, humanitarian corralling, and aerial surveillance, not for bulldozers. Grants arrive with phrases like stability, rule of law, and protection of critical infrastructure. Everyone knows what the critical infrastructure is. From Washington's vantage, the buffer doubles as a moat against headaches that travel north. Drug flows, insurgent spillover from Colombia's long conflict, and now extra-hemispheric actors, China, Russia seeking footholds in logistics and telecom. A road would increase mobility for everyone, not just truckers. When the security bureaucracy weighs monitoring versus movement, monitoring wins. Satellites, radars, vetted units, vetted lists. These are comfortable verbs. Asphalt is. Colombia's calculus rhymes, but the meter changes. The Darien sits at the fringe of a country whose internal geography has hosted insurgency for decades. Commanders map chokepoints the way hydrologists map narrows, places where flows can be measured, taxed, or stopped. The gap, with its limited corridors and natural bottlenecks, offers manageable uncertainty. Open a highway and you don't just speed trade, you speed adversaries and splinter groups that bloom when pressure shifts. Policymakers have learned to prefer known leak points over unknown floodplains. Incentives within security bureaucracies harden these preferences. Budgets grow around missions: surveil, interdict, report, repeat. Key performance indicators measure seizures, arrests, humanitarian throughputs, not miles paved. Careers advance on successful operations and quiet borders, not groundbreaking ceremonies that invite congressional hearings when costs balloon. The longer the wall functions, the more its function funds itself. Diplomatic choreography keeps the music steady. Bilateral working groups schedule joint patrols and intelligence exchanges. International partners finance scanners, boats, radios, and training. The money flows toward interdiction and resilience, not connection. When an official floats a corridor concept, the room stiffens. Someone mentions biosecurity. Someone mentions indigenous consultation. Someone mentions that the canal expansion still needs dredging funds after a low-rain year. The idea dies politely. Impact shows up in how crises dissipate. When a route spikes in violence, states nudge flows with small knobs. More patrols here, fewer boat permits there, a publicized arrest to reset fear. The wall behaves like a pressure valve: release, restrict, release. The goal isn't closure, it's tempo. You don't need to stop the music if you control the beat. Unknown to many outside these rooms, there's a quiet insurance logic at play. Rare catastrophes, pandemic pathogens, a foreign power leveraging a logistics hub, a mass casualty convoy incident can reshape politics. The buffer reduces tail risks by keeping movement slow, dispersed, hard to weaponize. Daily attrition costs are tragic, but they're not existential. It's a cold ledger, but it's the one that budgets recognize. There's a micro story from an interagency meeting in Washington. A proposal for a controlled corridor crosses the table: double fencing, sterilization bays, sealed freight, biometric gates. A Border Patrol veteran asks the only question that matters: who maintains it in year 5? Silence. An OMB staffer clears his throat. The slide clicks forward to alternatives. The old verbs return: monitor, train, disrupt. The moat stays. From Bogotá, a retired general draws a map with 3 circles: the Atrato Basin, the Serrania Spine, the Panamanian camps. He taps the narrow points with a pen. Here we can see the flow, here we can count it, here we can hand it off. Then he draws a line where a highway would run and shakes his head. We'd be chasing ghosts on 6 lanes. He doesn't mean it literally. He means budgets, manpower, and political bandwidth drain in directions doctrine can't predict. Meanwhile, the politics of visibility matter. Voters in Panama City and Medellin see helicopters and uniforms and believe control exists. A highway would put the movement in their windshields, in their neighborhoods, on their talk shows. The buffer keeps discomfort at the edges. Leaders red polls. Edges win. Critics call it abdication. Proponents call it prudence. Both miss the quiet equilibrium. The wall isn't just trees and mud. It's a set of incentives that align across capitals. Keep the canal humming. Keep insurgent geographies managed. Keep extra-hemispheric rivals out of the interior. Keep the liability of movement off the ledger. The jungle does the hardest part. You only have to avoid breaking it. So why not just fly over it? Because the jungle prints cash for those who tax the friction, and because the buffer prints political safety for those who govern the aftermath. The moat holds because too many castles rely on it. The cartel's business model of the gap. So why not just fly over it? Because the jungle prints cash and someone runs the press. The Gulf clan didn't invent smuggling, but they turned the gap into a logistics company with guns. Think routes, pricing, franchising, and vertical integration. Then add fear as the service guarantee. Start with revenue. Every head pays. Infants, elders, engineers, cooks. It's all a per-person fee scaled by route and season. On a calm week, a basic land crossing costs 1 price. After storms, the price rises with the river. Evidence from investigators put one slice of their take at tens of millions in less than a year. That's the visible surface of a larger ledger. Fees at beach staging, cut at docks, security on the trail, and taxes on every tortilla sold to those passing through. The product isn't passage, it's predictability. Packages look like airline fare classes. Basic buys a wristband color and a place in a column. Preferred adds faster boats, extra porters, and a radio code that earns priority at the rope crossings. Premium buys a boat leg that bypasses a ridge with a reputation and a night in a guarded camp where thieves don't bother trying. There's even aftercare, a phone number for a fixer when you hit the highway north of the camps. That's not hospitality, it's capture. Franchise logic keeps the machine humming. Local crews manage micro-segments, a cove, a ridge, a food stall near a ford. They don't compete on route, they compete on throughput and compliance. If they skim too much or let violence spike, the parent brand sends a correction, sometimes a phone call, sometimes a funeral. What nobody outside the system sees is the schedule. Columns leave at dawn for visibility in the canopy and timing at rivers. Night is for staging, recovery, and counting. The manager's job is to keep the cadence. Vertical integration turns costs into income. The same group controls outboard motors, fuel depots, porters, rope crossings, tents, and the credit line. Need a guide? They're on payroll. Need a boat? It's theirs. Need rice and beans? They own the stall. Need to borrow because your cash got stolen at the last checkpoint? Debt bonds you to a cousin in Necoclí, and the bill follows you to a coyote in Tapachula. If you default, a message arrives before you cross another border. Governance by ledger. Risk transfer is the quiet genius. Weather shifts, rivers rise, landslides erase a path. The cartel doesn't eat the delay, travelers do. If a guide misjudges a torrent and someone disappears, the column halts, then moves on. The replacement fee gets collected at the next staging. Storms are externalities, mud is margin. The system's promise is never safe. It's known. That's enough for people who don't have time to learn the jungle. Violence is calibrated, too much and flows drop. Too little and rivals test the edges. The brand signals control with wristbands, quotas, and route exclusivity. A yellow band doesn't just buy a shortcut. It marks you under a micro-jurisdiction. A machete at a checkpoint isn't random, it's a compliance tool. The point is to make every taker feel like the same hand. Predictability as sovereignty. Then there's the information layer. Runners relay headcounts, spotters report boat seizures, a radio crackles when a patrol sets up on the wrong bank. That data moves faster than mud. It allocates risk in real time, boat route today, ridge tomorrow. If a military photograph hits social media from one landing, that landing rests for a week and the next one earns more. The jungle is a network. They run the router. Corruption stitches the seams. A small fee on fuel makes inspections go away. A cut on dock permits keeps engines running. A gift at a police post turns into an escort for safety. Local leaders take a piece to keep the calm and keep outsiders from bringing heat. In the short term, this looks like order. In the long term, it hardens into criminal sovereignty, the kind that builds rules people obey because the alternatives are worse. Micro-stories reveal the calculus. A teenager selling empanadas outside a tarp camp won't admit who sets his hours, but he pays for his spot every morning. A boatman laughs when a traveler asks for a life jacket. "You bought a crossing," he says, "not a guarantee." A woman with a ledger checks off bands at dusk, totals the count, and radios a number that someone 100 kilometers away uses to price the next day's path. It looks improvised. It is. What happens when states intervene? The jungle taxes them too. A raid seizes engines, replacements appear from another cove. A patrol disrupts a ridge, boats add a leg and sell it as an upgrade. A publicized arrest trims competitors while the franchise consolidates. Enforcement becomes a marketing channel. This route is hot, pay more for the other. Meanwhile, the risk of flash floods and landslides stays on the traveler's back. Mud and math beat muscle. None of this works without demand. Hundreds of thousands move because push factors outrun borders, collapsed economies, violence, climate shocks, closed legal pathways. The cartel doesn't manufacture that, it monetizes it. It didn't build the wall, it sells the gate. And when you tally the business, you see why breaking the model takes more than patrols. You'd have to kill the product, uncertainty, and replace it with something cheaper and safer at scale. Until then, the jungle prints cash on a schedule, engineering and the wristband is the receipt. And when states intervene, the jungle fights back in mud and math. Engineers learn this the hard way. Start with the ground itself. The Atrato lowlands aren't soil, they're soup. Swamps, peat mats that float, and clays that swell and shrink with the rain. 20+ feet of it a year. You don't build on that, you try to float over it. Every solution you sketch turns into a maintenance payment you can't stop making. Geology isn't background here. Under the peat sits soft Holocene alluvium, then pockets of unstable clays that behave like toothpaste when saturated. Cut a trench and you don't get a neat profile, you get a slump. Embankments don't stand, they ooze. The standards that make highways work on firm ground become jokes in a place where the water table licks the surface 9 months out of 12. What looks like land is seasonally a lake. Survey crews in the 196s and 197s learned the vocabulary of failure. Cone penetrometer tests came back with numbers that made bridge designers stare. Piles had to be driven deeper than budgets liked, through layers that wouldn't hold a toe. Every meter added to a span meant more scour calculations on rivers that move sideways as much as forward. You can draw a bridge, you can't make a river respect it. Bridges versus causeways sounds like a choice. It is. Causeways demand fill. Fill demands burrow pits and truck convoys. Truck convoys demand haul roads that sink the moment the rains come. Build a dike of dirt in a floodplain and you don't just lift a road, you dam a watershed. The flood goes somewhere else, usually onto the embankment you just raised. The fix is culverts and more culverts, then culverts for the culverts. Maintenance multiplies. Bridges dodge that, but they introduce new enemies. Scour eats piers where rivers drop their sediment loads. Debris rafts slam into superstructures during flash floods. Sediment booms and cofferdams are theory until the first brown wall of water arrives at night with a forest's worth of logs. A span that looked elegant on paper needs massive abutments and sacrificial islands. One season's storms can shift channels enough to strand an approach like a pier to nowhere. Then the earth shakes. The region isn't quiet. Colombia's north is seismically alive. Designed for lateral loads and you beef up every joint and bearing. Add corrosion from perpetual humidity and warm, acidic soils, and you've built a machine that rusts faster than you can micromanage. Each bridge becomes a promise to fund inspections and replacements forever. Miss a year, and the structure tells you in cracks and brown streaks. The roadbed itself refuses to play nice. Tropical clays pump fines under repeated axle loads, turning subgrades into tapioca. Pavement designed to shed water pools instead as ruts deepen. Geotextiles help until they clog with organics and lose permeability. Geogrids spread load, but only as long as theft and animals don't tear them out before the asphalt goes down. Every kilometer gains a checklist. Every checklist grows in a jungle that eats checklists. Construction camps become their own risk factors. Bring in hundreds of workers, and you import disease vectors, malaria, dengue, leptospirosis. Latrines overflow in wet season. Standing water blooms mosquitoes. Food chains lure rodents. Biosecurity protocols that look tidy in binders falter when yellow raincoats tear and generators fail. AFTOSA is the headline risk, but the daily grind is tropical medicine and public health in a place with no easy medevac. Enforcement adds cost in strange places. To keep the prophylactic barrier intact during construction, you'd need disinfection stations for vehicles and boots, sealed supply chains for animal products, inspections at every gate. That's not a one-time capital outlay. It's payroll, chemicals, training, audits, forever. Miss one truck on a muddy Friday, and the whole premise of biosecurity collapses. Cost ranges once cautious balloon. Early alignment estimates whispered hundreds of millions. Add bridges that grow like vines on a plan set, and you're in the billions. But the capital expenditure is the easy lie. In rainforests, operating expense dwarfs capex. Drainage doesn't maintain itself. Vegetation management never ends. Guardrails rot, culverts clog. Slopes slough after a week of storms, and you're back with excavators you had to fly in because last month's landslide cut the access road to the quarry. There's a micro story from a river crossing near the Pacific slope. A contractor installed a temporary Bailey bridge to get equipment across a tributary that looked tame. The first real rain turned the stream into a conveyor of trees. The bridge held barely until a beech trunk jammed against a pier and the water found a new path around the abutment under the approach embankment. By morning, the approach hung like a cliff. The fix cost more than the bridge. Meanwhile, the calendar stretches. Wet season becomes too wet to compact, and dry season becomes too dry for haul boats to load upriver. The logistics tail whips the budget. Helicopters become line items nobody wanted. Every blade hour buys time you lose when a tropical storm parks for a week offshore. Productivity assumptions evaporate in humidity. Engineers can answer each problem with a technique. Deep piles, long spans, high-performance concrete, geosynthetics, cathodic protection, drainage galleries, armored slopes, intelligent monitoring. It's all possible. But possible isn't sustainable when the upkeep requires a state to behave like an oil major maintaining an offshore platform. Miss a cycle and failure accelerates. And yet, even if you fund the nightmare, the road doesn't sit quietly. Roads attract settlers. Settlers light fires to clear edges. Edges erode. Erosion undermines culverts. Undermined culverts collapse. The broken culvert becomes a ford. The ford becomes a rumor that the state doesn't maintain its promises. That rumor becomes budget politics in a capital far away, and the next appropriation shrinks. Any roadway here becomes a permanent subsidy sink. The jungle prints invoices with the same regularity the cartels print cash. You can pay those invoices, but you can't stop them. And when you factor in the sanitary locks you'd have to keep clicking shut every day, the nightmare isn't a monster. It's a calendar invite that never leaves your screen. But something else locks the door: law. The legal and treaty locks. Law moves slower than rivers, but it carves deeper. After the mud and the microbes, the last lock on the door is a mesh of statutes, treaties, and financing rules that behave like vines around steel. You can cut one, but the rest tighten. Start with a case few outside Washington remember. When the Sierra Club sued over U.S. funding for the Gap closure in the mid-1970s, they didn't just invoke trees. They invoked NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, and forced agencies to treat a foreign project like a domestic one because U.S. money and decisions were involved. The question wasn't, can America regulate Panama? It was, can federal agencies spend without a lawful environmental review? The answer from the bench was no. That principle stuck. Any future US involvement triggers procedural breaks, alternatives analysis, cumulative impacts, public comment, before a single survey stake goes in. Extraterritorial or not, the effect is practical. If US funds, permits, or guarantees touch the project, a full environmental impact statement becomes a gate you can't run. Agencies also have to reconcile that EIS with sanitary risk assessments from USDA and APHIS. The AFTOSA logic you heard earlier steps into the record as expert testimony. A paved corridor raises the probability of disease entry. Now NEPA's hard look has a biosecurity chapter with teeth. Judges don't need to love elephants to respect cattle. Across the border, another legal spine hardens the map. Indigenous land rights aren't a footnote, they're title. In Panama, comarcas, semi-autonomous indigenous territories cover big swathes of the Darien with constitutional status and consultation requirements. Colombia's rescados mirror that logic. Free, prior, and informed consent isn't a slogan, it's an obligation under national law and international norms like ILO Convention 169 and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Miss a step, and a court can void your right of way. Meet the steps, and you accept timelines that don't match construction season. Layer on biodiversity protections. Darien National Park and Los Casios aren't lines on a brochure. They're UNESCO World Heritage Sites and national parks with prohibitions on road building and strict rules on any works near their buffers. International conventions, CITES and the Convention on Biological Diversity don't ban roads, but they compel states to avoid significant adverse impacts on listed species and habitats. Prosecutors now have frameworks to demand mitigation that, in rainforest math, often equals don't do it. Trade law then does something counterintuitive. The WTO's Sanitary and Phytosanitary (SBS) agreement lets countries adopt measures necessary to protect human, animal, or plant life, provided they're science-based and not disguised trade barriers. USDA and APHIS position the gap as a sanitary measure, an absence that functions like a barrier. To change that, a corridor backer would have to prove that road-era controls, sterilization, sealed freight, inspection regimes achieve an equivalent level of protection. That's not a slide in a deck. It's a verification regime forever. Lose confidence once, and export markets can snap shut under their own SBS shields. Financing is where idealism dies. Multilateral development banks, World Bank, IDB, and export credit agencies carry safeguard frameworks, environmental and social risk standards, biodiversity offsets, resettlement rules, indigenous consent, cultural heritage protection. ESG is no longer marketing, it's covenants. A rainforest highway through protected and indigenous areas across disease control lines lights up every risk flag. Lenders demand de-risking at costs that make the pro forma sweat. Insurers add exclusions, sabotage, disease shutdowns, landslides, force majeure that turn fixed-price dreams into cost-plus nightmares. Private capital reads the term sheets and walks. National courts add local bite. In Colombia, tutela actions, rights protections, can halt projects that threaten fundamental rights or environmental heritage. In Panama, constitutional challenges and administrative courts scrutinize concessions and consultations. Neither state is uniformly strict, but the precedent stack leans toward caution in frontier zones where protected areas, indigenous titles, and international commitments overlap. The result isn't a single veto, it's interlocking locks. Even if a government waved a flag and invited bulldozers, agencies would have to clear NEPA-like procedures where US involvement exists, prove SBS equivalency to calm cattle markets, secure indigenous consent that can be lawfully withheld, design biodiversity mitigations that seldom pencil in rainforests, satisfy MDB safeguards without triggering lethal conditions precedent, and place insurance on infrastructure that the jungle treats like a consumable. There's a micro moment that explains the mood. A project finance lawyer meets an engineer over coffee in Bogotá. The engineer sketches a span count. The lawyer sketches a risk matrix, NEPA exposure if US guarantees appear, SBS equivalency burden, ILO 169 consent risk, World Heritage proximity, resettlement liabilities, OPEX obligations. He circles the last box, lender step-in rights, and shrugs. Step into what? He asks. The jungle, the microbes, and the law all answer the same way. Meanwhile, history leaves clues in abandoned maps, route alternatives archived with annotations, cultural area, wetland, park, read like a legal minefield. Each note is a previous collision with a statute or a treaty. Investors treat them as warning signs, not curiosities. So the mesh holds, not because one heroic law blocks a bulldozer, but because dozens of modest rules force a question the project can't answer. Who pays forever for the risks a road multiplies? Until someone can say we do, with law, science, consent, and money aligned, the vines don't let go. The Pan-American highway's ghost. While the legal mesh tightens, the ghosts come out in paper form: archival memos, route maps, insurance riders with coffee stains. They tell a story of momentum that felt unstoppable until it evaporated. In a 1942 map, the line through Darien looks inevitable, a neat stitch between continents with notes on cost share, US 2/3, Latin America 1/3. 30 years later, the margins are crowded with caveats, arrows pointing to wetlands, and penciled circles over cultural sites. The line fades from ink to aspiration. Inside one State Department folder, a memo weighs route alternatives like a game of river hopscotch. Atrato corridor with heavy bridging, Pacific slope with cut and fill, mountain spur with switchbacks that made pilots queasy just looking at the contour lines. The cost columns climb from ambitious to politically unsellable. In a margin, someone writes, Nixon wants 1976. The next page asks, who signs the O&M checks in 1986? That gap between ribbon and rust never closed. Contractors withdrew not with a bang but with addenda. A consortium's letter cites new exclusions from insurers, sabotage, landslide loss, disease shutdowns, and requests premium adjustments that turn bids into liabilities. Brokers, fresh from nervy calls, slide in clauses about political risk triggers if indigenous consultations stall. The engineering teams can still build. The financial scaffolding can't stand the sway. On the ground, sabotage isn't cinematic. A fuel depot empties overnight. A stockpile of rebar grows legs. Survey flags vanish under regrowth so fast that crews joke the forest wears camo. A cleared approach fills with saplings between dry seasons. A rumor spreads that a bridge pier failed before it opened. The truth is blunter. The access road collapsed twice, and the third fix missed budget approval. Either way, the span never took a truck. Micro-stories pile up like driftwood. A pilot drops a sling load of drilling pipe onto a clearing that yesterday was firm. Today it's pudding. The pipe half sinks, then keels over like a masthead. A welder curses as his machine shorts in mist that never lifts. A junior engineer writes home that he's learned 3 new words for mud and 8 for delay. The jungle reads their schedules and smiles. Investors look sideways at lessons from other frontiers. BR-163 in Brazil starts as a promise, then sprouts a deforestation halo you can see from orbit. The interoceanic highway in Peru binds to corruption probes and maintenance budgets that wheeze. Each road becomes a cautionary tale in due diligence decks. Special conditions multiply until they're indistinguishable from a red light. Boards ask, what's our exit if the court enjoins in year 3? Nobody likes the answer. Back in the archives, a 1977 audit notes that 1/3 of a precursor road segment is complete, except for paving, another 1/5 under construction, and the completion date slipping right off the calendar. The executive summary says delays stem from terrain, coordination, and compliance. The annex translates swamp, politics, and law. A year later, inflation turns yesterday's millions into today's rounding error, and tomorrow's cost into a number that keeps being revised up. Insurance is the quiet undertaker. Underwriters broaden force majeure until everything that happens in rainforest construction qualifies. Acts of God, acts of government, acts of microbes. Project finance needs certainty. The jungle offers variance. Without cover, lenders retreat, and equity alone won't shoulder a road that demands perpetual subsidy. Meanwhile, the archive holds the near misses. A bridge design with elegant trusses over a river that moved 2 bends downstream. A causeway drawn across a wetland that an ecologist labeled living sponge don't plug. A resettlement plan with boxes for names that a local leader refused to fill. Every plan carries a ghost of what would have followed: shops, schools, a checkpoint, a billboard. All of it suspended in might have been. Lessons from other frontier roads harden into a deterrence portfolio. Maintenance tails eat budgets. Enforcement decays. Edge effects outpace mitigations. Investors in 202 read 197's minutes like weather forecasts. The fronts that stalled then still hang over the map. The Pan-American dream still shows up at conferences, but now it shares a panel with risk officers and epidemiologists who speak softly and close folders slowly. The most telling artifact is a map with the gap still labeled proposed, long after everyone stopped proposing. Ghost infrastructure has a job to warn. It does. The files travel in PDFs now, attached to emails that end with "not recommended at this time." Boards nod, ministries pivot, the jungle hums. If the highway won't come, the people will, on foot. The human conveyor. If the highway won't come, the people will on foot. Since 2021, the flow swelled from a trickle to a river with faces from everywhere. Venezuelan families with strollers that won't roll in mud. Haitians who left Brazil and Chile after work dried up. Ecuadorians, Colombians, Peruvians. Then Senegal, India, China, Afghanistan. WhatsApp routes stitching continents to a jungle they've never seen. The convoy changes languages at campfires. What actually happens is a system built from need. On the Colombian beaches, families write numbers on their children's arms with a marker, phone digits that might be the only way to stitch a family back together after a river crossing scatters them. A volunteer nurse tapes gauze to feet already white with trench rot. Camp announcements rotate through Spanish, Haitian Creole, Portuguese, and a fourth language someone translates on a phone. The first day in the trees, the math hits. 10 hours of climbing with 50 pounds of life on a back. Water is weight, so people ration. The ones who trained in city parks discover training wasn't preparation. A father counts his daughter's steps, 50 rest, and texts a pin when the satellite tracker briefly sees sky. 2 hours later, the phone beeps. Signal lost. Humanitarian corridors form where states want them. Staging camps with tarps, water bladders, latrines, and a triage tent that smells like chlorine and damp clothing. NGOs rotate shifts. Doctors Without Borders, the Red Cross, local church clinics, tagging wounds, checking for dehydration, treating snake bites, and quietly logging sexual violence reports in a back room with a curtain for privacy. There's a corner with donated clothes. A single dry sweater becomes a lifeline traded for food 2 days later. Micro-stories carry the weight. A Panamanian nurse kneels beside a boy whose feet are 2 raw blisters. She warms saline in her hands before flushing the wounds. He winces anyway. Later, she texts her mother that she's never seen so much pain in so many small places: ankles, eyes, mouths, lungs. But the thing that breaks her is the quiet. In a tent nearby, a father stares at a phone watching WhatsApp pings that stopped somewhere near a ridge with no name. He holds the screen like it's warm. Economics trail every step. Families sell jewelry in Necoclí to buy a crossing, then borrow for food north of the camps. Remittances run backward. Cousins in New Jersey wire $200 to a kiosk under a tarp so the last bus to Costa Rica doesn't leave without their people. Every price reflects the jungle's leverage. A bottle of water costs what a day's labor pays in places left behind. A seat on a truck north of the reception center is cheaper if you can stand for hours and hold a sleeping child. Predation blooms in the gaps. Thieves track columns and wait at chokepoints where the trail narrows to single file. Sexual violence shadows the path, often unreported, until survivors reach clinics and decide to speak. Aid workers learn to keep an extra flashlight charged for interviews, because power flickers and people tell truths only when they're not lit like suspects. States do triage, not miracles. On the Panamanian side, SENAFONT patrols steer columns toward buses that will move them out of border districts as quickly as capacity allows. Temporary bridges appear after storms, then wash away and get rebuilt from parts that drive in the day the river falls. On the Colombian side, mayors ask for resources and get visits, then promises, then a news cycle. Prosecutors announce arrests. The routes blink, then return. Rescue is a verb in flood season. A helicopter lowers a sling to a family clinging to a branch in chocolate water. A soldier clips a harness, the baby goes first. On the ground, volunteers run a zip line across a narrow tributary and pull people one by one until hands bleed. The next day, the river shrinks and leaves behind a wall of branches studded with sandals and a single red backpack. The conveyor doesn't just move bodies, it moves decisions. At each camp, families choose whether to pause, push, or pivot. Some call relatives and learn Mexico hardened its visa rules. They consider asylum in Costa Rica or Panama. Others count debts and decide north is the only option because creditors don't accept policy shifts as payment. A mother recalculates when she learns her sister made it to Texas 2 months earlier via a route that now costs more. She buys a cheaper bus and pays later in nights on a floor. In the background, data becomes policy. Headcounts, nationalities, ages, injuries, numbers that feed ministries and embassies, numbers that decide how many buses run and how many tents arrive. A field coordinator taps a laptop and sees flows doubling week over week after a passport change in the Caribbean. The map updates, but the mud stays the same. The wall works like a scar that never heals. It seals just enough to look closed from afar, then reopens under pressure. People cross anyway because the alternative is staying put, where staying put is a slow loss. They become a living argument that a line on a map isn't a policy, it's a cost center. And every step they take adds to a ledger nobody in a capital city has to pay in person. So what would it actually take to break the wall, or name it? We are down to 3 futures, and each one writes a different bill. No road fortress is the path we're already on, just with intent. The state says it out loud. No highway, no permanent bridges, no corridor. You bulk up the humanitarian conveyor, bigger camps, faster buses out, better rescue, and starve the smuggling business with safe visas upstream so fewer people enter the jungle in the first place. You harden biosecurity, more support to AFTOSA eradication south of the line, sensor networks on livestock corridors, syndromic surveillance at borders. You back indigenous-led conservation compacts that pay for stewardship, not asphalt. The payoff is predictable risks and preserved buffers. The cost is permanent friction. Under integration, a criminal toll road you can only thin, and a moral ledger that keeps filling because geography is doing work policy won't claim. Controlled corridor is the compromise every whiteboard loves. Think double fence spine with access-controlled gates, sealed freight lanes only, no private vehicles. Every truck runs tamper evidence seals, RFID tags, and cold chain locks where needed. At entry and exit, you build sterilization bays, high-pressure tire and undercarriage washes, boot baths, UV tunnels for pallets, and positive pressure inspection halls. Vector controls along the right-of-way, mosquito abatement, rodent exclusion, enclosed waste handling, wildlife overpasses, culvert frequency high enough to keep hydrology honest, indigenous co-governance at stations with veto power on expansion, live data backbone, sensors for temperature, seal integrity, animal product signatures, and a disease trigger that shuts the corridor within hours if a red flag trips. You staff it like an airport meets a biolab. Biosafety officers, veterinarians, customs, and auditors with authority to stop the line. Here's the problem, O&M eats you. Corruption leaks through hairline cracks, one bribe at a gate, one disabled sprayer, one inspector on a cousin's payroll, and equivalency to the prophylactic barrier collapses. Fencing becomes scrap metal unless you fund patrols forever. Wildlife overpasses need maintenance or they become trap points. The sterilization chemistry wrecks bearings if operators get sloppy. And the deforestation halo doesn't care about your good intentions. Once you put a service track down, chainsaws find it. You can design redundancy and punishments. You can't design away entropy without a budget that survives elections. Full integration is the ribbon-cut fantasy, scaled. 6 lanes, open passenger traffic, towns bloom, ports plug into inland depots, and trucks from Santiago roll to San Jose in days. You win on trade gravity and lose on control. Biosecurity goes from binary to probabilistic. Low-slung pickups splash virus farther than freight you conceal. Edge effects explode. Policing becomes whack-a-mole from Colón to Medellin. The cartel's model adapts to tax speed instead of mud. You gain GDP and spend it on problems your spreadsheets underpriced. So if controlled corridor is the only serious build scenario, What would make it less brittle? First, change the product. Don't sell speed, sell certainty for sealed freight only. Passenger movement stays off the spine. Build vector-proof hubs north and south of the gap. Negative pressure docks, bag-in/bag out loading, independent power and water so outages don't force dirty workarounds. Second, move enforcement from people to systems. Integrity first. Design, bolted, sensorized, and logged, makes human failure visible in real time. Third, make the cost of cheating catastrophic. SBS equivalency depends on trust. One breach should trigger automatic shutdown and export penalties nobody wants to pay. Publish that rule, then actually pull the plug once. Fourth, starve the deforestation halo. No settlement access, no fuel stations, no spur roads. Service tracks are removable matting, not graded lanes. Patrol with drones and satellite change detection, feeding fines that bite and seizures that stick. Fifth, governance. Indigenous and park authorities hold real seats with budget authority and a power to halt operations if commitments slip. You want legitimacy? Share the off switch. Now failure modes. Corruption leakage turns the corridor into a smuggler's conveyor with paperwork. O&M spirals when parts arrive late, chemicals run out, and operators cut corners to keep trucks moving. A landslide takes out a sterilization bay, the backup fails, the line reopens dirty because a minister can't afford footage of a queue. Within months, you've built an expensive placebo that satisfies no one and increases risk. Economic upside modeling will tempt you. Refrigerated produce reaching new markets, lowered inventory costs, inland clusters humming. But the ecological and biosecurity downside keeps a knife at your throat. You're betting that institutions in two countries and their partners will maintain an airport-grade biosafety regime in a rainforest road context for decades. That's a tall bet even for rich states on dry ground. Political feasibility. Veto players stack across three layers. Local, indigenous congresses, mayors who fear becoming highway towns, park directors with mandates, communities that learned what roads bring. National, ministries of environment, health, agriculture, transport, each with reasons to say not now. External, US APHIS and cattle lobbies guarding sanitary status, MDB boards guarding safeguards, trading partners ready to slam SBS doors if trust breaks. Anyone can stall you. Together, they define the center of gravity. So where does that leave you? Even the best-case corridor is fragile. The worst case accelerates risks you can't roll back, which brings us to the uncomfortable twist. Maybe the wall is doing a job we don't want to admit. The hidden function of the wall. Here's the twist. The wall may be doing a job nobody wants to admit in public. Call it acceptable friction. Movement is possible, but slow enough to manage, costly enough to deter, dispersed enough to monitor. It's not a policy on paper, it's a handshake between risk and convenience. The jungle supplies the drag. Governments and markets quietly price it in. From a security desk in Panama City, friction buys time. Drug flows leak through chokepoints you can count. Migrant surges arrive in waves you can stage, bus, and pass along. A highway would turn pulses into streams. From Washington's vantage, the moat reduces tail risks. A biosecurity breach that wrecks cattle markets, a terror transit that moves too fast to flag, a rival power leveraging a logistics artery. Daily attrition is tragic, but it's not systemic. Friction keeps bad days from becoming defining weeks. Strategic ambiguity makes it palatable. Nobody declares, we need a natural wall. Instead, leaders praise conservation, cite AFTOSA, promise humanitarian response, and fund interdiction. Industry applauds canal reliability and port expansion. Environmental groups defend parks. Indigenous authorities defend land. Each actor speaks their own language, but their incentives rhyme. The outcome, no road, doesn't need a vote. It emerges. Insurance logic seals it. Rare catastrophes move markets. Steady pain doesn't. A road would concentrate risk, pathogens, conflict, corruption into a corridor that underwriters would price brutally. The jungle diffuses risk into mud and terrain. Losses remain local, unpredictable, and therefore insurable in pieces. The global system prefers 1,000 small claims to one big one. There's a moral hazard hiding in that comfort. Outsourcing border pain to geography lets states avoid owning the cruelty. The jungle decides who makes it. Cartels control the risk. Governments handle the back end with buses and blankets. The ledger looks clean in a capital. The bill is paid in blisters, debt, and bodies recovered downstream. It isn't an accident. It's a tolerated outcome of acceptable friction. Financialized geography feeds on stasis. Who profits today? Port operators expanding for cargo that can't shift inland. Airlines selling emergency air freight because trucks can't roll. Maritime insurers booking premiums on routes made brittle by lack of redundancy. Cartel accountants tallying per head revenue on a trail sold as the only land option. Even some local economies skim the churn, rooms to rent, food to sell, services to offer when the column stops. It's not development, it's subsistence off a moving wound. Meanwhile, politicians across borders earn the benefits of strategic ambiguity. They can claim environmental virtue to green constituencies, sanitary vigilance to ranchers, law and order postures to centrists, and humanitarian compassion to rights advocates without resolving the contradiction. The wall provides plausible deniability. It's the jungle, they say. It's the terrain. It's complicated. It is, but not in the way they claim. What nobody knew at the beginning, but everyone acts on now, is that the system stabilizes because each stakeholder gets enough. The canal stays primed. Biosecurity margins hold. Security bureaucracies keep tools they trust. Donor money funds interdiction and relief. Criminal sovereignty extracts predictable rents. Voters see crises handled at the edge, not in their neighborhoods. The result is a system optimized for nobody yet sustained by everyone. Micro stories expose the ethic. A minister visits a reception camp, vows more buses, and tweets a photo with a child. That night, a procurement memo delays funding for upstream safe visas, too controversial. A shipper lobbies for another port crane to fix supply chain resiliency, then backs away from a land bridge study that threatens ocean margins. An indigenous Congress rejects a consultation timeline for a controlled corridor. The finance press calls it obstruction. It's protection. Each move preserves friction. Meanwhile, the risk of naming the wall terrifies officials. Say it out loud. We're using geography to manage flows, and you inherit the moral and legal burden to mitigate the pain you've outsourced. You'd have to expand safe pathways, crush the cartel toll road, fund biosecurity to redundancy, and pay indigenous stewards at the scale of their service. That's expensive and politically sharp. Silence is cheaper. So what now? Break it or name it? Break it implies building. We've seen the bill. Biosecurity risks you can't fully cage, ecological costs that compound, O&M obligations that outlast terms in office, and a deforestation halo that your successors will inherit. Name it implies owning the friction, accepting that the wall is policy, not jungle, and redesigning how it works. Owning it would mean changing where the friction lives, move it off bodies and into systems, starve the cartel's business by offering safe, fast legal pathways upstream, strip uncertainty from sealed freight with vector-proof hubs and published SBS shutdown rules that trading partners trust. Pay indigenous communities to keep the ecological corridor intact, because that service protects more than beauty, it protects markets. It also means admitting the equilibrium isn't accidental. It's a choice, just distributed, deniable, and comfortable for those not crossing. The wall isn't natural, it's negotiated. And if we're going to keep it, we should at least have the honesty to say what job it's doing, who it protects, who it harms, and who gets paid. The reckoning, policy levers that matter. If we won't pave the jungle, we can still move the friction. Start with biosecurity, first integration. Build twin vector-proof freight hubs north and south of the gap, sealed docks, negative pressure loading, UV tunnels, tire and undercarriage sterilization, and independent power. Every sealed unit gets sensorized locks and live temperature, seal breach, and route telemetry tied to shutdown rules trading partners accept. Publish the rule. One red flag, corridor pauses. Connect without roads. Fund rail sea intermodal, short sea ro-ro shuttles between Colombian and Panamanian coasts, synchronized with inland rail and highway spines. Add customs pre-clearance at the hubs so containers move like pipelines, not errands. Offer fast lanes only to certified biosecure shippers. Everyone else waits. Target the toll road. Sanction the franchise, not just faces. List shell firms, seize boats and outboards, freeze fuel depots and prosecute debt bondage. Pair the stick with safe visas upstream. Humanitarian parole, labor slots, family reunification fast tracks, so demand abandons the jungle queue. Guarantee protection pathways in Costa Rica, Panama, and Colombia with funding that buys buses, clinics, and investigators, not just tarps. Back indigenous-led conservation compacts. Pay for patrols, monitoring, and cultural governance with long contracts, not grants. Tie payments to independently verified forest integrity and wildlife connectivity. Put satellites and acoustic sensors to work as a shared backbone, hydrology gauges, disease syndromic alerts, and real-time land use change. Publish the feeds, let investors and prosecutors act. The point isn't speed. It's certainty, predictable, sealed freight, legal human mobility, fewer incentives for violence, and a corridor of trees that still works like a shield. What the wall really costs. This wall isn't nature, it's a policy built from silence, priced in human risk, and paid in lost futures. If you want the whole map of hidden tolls and quiet moats shaping our lives, watch the next film on chokepoints. Subscribe to GeoQuest for more untold infrastructure stories, then share this with someone who thinks the jungle decides.